Is the United States staying or going? First, Donald Trump abruptly decides to pull out of northeast Syria, prompting the resignation of his defense secretary. Then he dispatches his national security advisor to the region, John Bolton, who, to reassure Israel and the Syrian Kurds backed by Washington, starts to roll back the timeline for a pullout as he seeks assurances from Ankara to safeguard the Kurdish-led Syrian forces the U.S. has been training in the fight against ISIS. Now, though, the trip has ended with a rebuke. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, furious over the U.S.'s continued support for said Kurdish forces. In the end, no press conference by Bolton, no meeting with Erdogan. Erdogan, who vows to press on with an offensive in northeast Syria to take on militias allied with the Turkish Kurdish PKK insurgency. Now, fearing they'll be left on their own to face foes in Turkey and Iran, those Syrian Kurds putting out feelers in the past weeks to Damascus and Moscow as Trump's Secretary of State kicks off his own Mideast tour. What next out of Washington? What next for Syria? What next for the wider region? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about Erdogan's rebuke. Joining us from Washington, he advised to Donald Trump during the presidential campaign, Walid Fares, author of The Lost Spring. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
From Istanbul, Talha Köse teaches at Ibn Khaldun University, researcher at the SETA Foundation, a think tank. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
From Amman, Jasmine El Gamal, non-resident fellow, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we say happy 2019 to Nadim Houri, director of the terror and counterterror programs at Human Rights Watch.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag F24debate. So much for assurances. Recep Tayyip Erdogan effectively telling the Turkish parliament it's full steam ahead with a planned offensive in northeast Syria. Haxi Mars-Belkin has more.
Turkey was the only NATO member to welcome the US Army's announced departure from Syria. Now, with the troop withdrawal seemingly delayed, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is furious.
It is not possible to accept or swallow the message given by Bolton from Israel.
The words he saw as such a provocation, the White House National Security Advisor pledging not to abandon the Turkish fighters in northern Syria, considered terrorists by Ankara.
We're going to be discussing the president's decision to withdraw, but to do so from northeast Syria in a way that makes sure that ISIS is defeated and to take care of those who have fought with us against ISIS and other terrorist groups.
For the majority of Syria's protracted civil war, the US has provided the Kurdish YPG militia in the north of the country with military backing against the Islamic State group. Indeed, it was the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, comprised mainly of the YPG, that recaptured the jihadists' de facto capital Raqqa in 2017. But when US President Donald Trump defied warnings from his advisors and announced a complete US pullout from Syria, the Kurds started looking for new allies. After capturing the Kurdish enclave of Afrin in northwest Syria, Turkey is now also threatening to take the city of Manbij from SDF control. Terrified that the departure of US troops from the area will pave the way for a Turkish offensive, the Kurds began to retreat from Manbij, turning warily to Damascus and its backer Moscow for help. At the end of December, the YPG issued a statement urging President Bashar al-Assad's forces to assert control over the areas their forces had withdrawn from, in particular Manbij, and to protect these areas against a Turkish invasion. The Syrian army immediately mobilized to the town. The YPG is clearly exploring its options, although that could change if John Bolton's right in suggesting the US withdrawal from Syria won't be happening as quickly as initially suggested. The country's Kurds say they're awaiting clarification from the Trump administration.
Walid Fares, John Bolton, when he went to Ankara, remember 24 hours ago we were saying maybe they're going to gloss over some of the differences or maybe find some solutions. There was talk even of new weapons sales. It didn't go the way the U.S. would have liked.
Well, it's not just about the ambassador. The ambassador is carrying the orders, instructions, the vision of the president. But there is, in the optics of it, a difference. The president did not sink into the details. He just mentioned, he announced, as we all know, that eventually the United States wants to withdraw. So there will be no permanent presence of Americans in Syria. There will be no bases. That's the most important idea he wanted to convey to the American public. So Turkey got probably excited about the idea that the United States is going to withdraw, the regime as well, because that would give them advantages on the ground for their own multiple vision and agenda. The ambassador, Ambassador Bolton, before the president made that statement, said that American forces are staying till ending ISIS on the one hand, securing our allies, but he even added one more point, which is making sure that Iranian forces will withdraw from Syria. So he went really ahead of the statement of the president. When he went to Turkey to convey those messages, I think that President Erdogan was very clear. He didn't want to hear about condition number 2, which is to maintain the SDF, YPG if you want, or the Kurdish forces, in any form or shape. This indicates that the plan in Ankara is different than the plan in Washington, as far as I understand.
Are you suggesting as well that what Bolton is saying is different from what Donald Trump is saying?
It completes. I got this question many times here. The president did not develop his position. He said, that's what I want to do. And he added, of course, over the past weeks, in terms of tweets, in terms of statements, we want to make sure that our friends are safe. Now, the National Security Advisor will go to Turkey to make sure that Turkey accept the principle that the American allies will be safe, and then demand and ask from Ankara, what is it that you really want that we can help you with, we can work with? Is it against ISIS or against the regime? Let's see what common ground. This is why Ambassador Bolton spoke about common ground. But it seems that the position of Turkey is that first we handle YPG, then we talk about everything else. So there is a large difference between Turkey and the U.S. on this issue in Syria.
Talal Kuza, it's not good when John Bolton scraps the press conference. There's the photo op is canceled between him and Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Where is that common ground between Turkey and the United States?
Actually,
well,
there
at least he met.
Common ground between,
oh, sorry.
There was a common ground between two presidents. They agreed that they will deal with the Syrian problem, pull out, and Turkey will deal with the security issues in the northern Syria. So there was no agreement on YPG. YPG is recognized as a terrorist group by Turkey, which is part of the PKK. And Turkey's national security is not part of the negotiation, which was clearly mentioned by all the actors. So that was clear, but unfortunately, John Bolton tried to renegotiate the deal between two presidents. So he come up with new conditions, and he come up with new, issues on the file. So Erdogan and Turkish diplomatic team decided not to negotiate this because this wasn't part of the deal.
You bring up an important you bring up an important point there, Talal, which is this all began before that initial tweet from Donald Trump announcing the pullout. There was that phone call between Trump and Erdogan last month. You're disagreeing, in effect, with Walid Fares. You're saying John Bolton is not in step with what Donald Trump told Recep Tayyip Erdogan last month.
Exactly. So they decided to coordinate the withdrawal, which includes dealing with the issue of U.S. troops, but Turkish president didn't give any promise about YPG. So that was very clear from the beginning. But John Bolton and his team, they decided to renegotiate the agreement, which is not a starter at this moment. So President Erdogan, which is article to New York Times, he sticks to the agreement with President Trump. We will save the Syria. We will keep areas from Daesh clear from the Daesh, and we will help American troops to withdraw this, and we will coordinate this with our friends in the field. So, which does not include the YPG, which is a radical organization that's also oppressing the other Kurds in the field. So there are some hundreds of thousands of Kurds who escaped to Turkey because of the operations of the YPG. So that wasn't part of the deal. So unfortunately, Bolton tried to renegotiate the deal, which didn't happen.
All right. In his tweet on Monday, Donald Trump didn't take aim against John Bolton, but the New York Times. He said, quote, no different from my original statements, we will be leaving at a proper pace while at the same time continuing to fight ISIS and doing all else that is prudent and necessary. Jasmine El-Gamal, what do you make of U.S. policy right now when it comes to that announced pullout from northeast Syria?
Francois, I think this whole thing has been an exercise in how not to conduct diplomacy, basically. The Trump administration has done everything completely backwards, from how they decided to announce the decision to the American public, to how they decided to announce it or not announce it in advance to our allies and partners on the ground, especially to the Kurds, who are our partners, as it's been mentioned before on the show, to give them advance warning of the pullout. There's no timeline. There's no schedule. I think Mr. Faris is being very generous when he describes this as a vision on the part of the president. The president, yes, indeed, has always wanted to get out of Syria and to withdraw our troops from Syria. But the way that this has taken place, from the announcement to the implementation to the diplomacy itself, has been a big mess.
And where does it stand right now? What do you see? What is, because we're talking about leaving in 60 days, leaving in 120 days. What do you see after this visit by Bolton?
So it's really hard to tell right now, Francois, because it's hard to tell who's actually making the decision about the timeline. The president came out initially and said that we were withdrawing immediately. Once he said that, the Turks obviously did not like that very much, because they wanted a more controlled and more coordinated pullout to ensure that when the Americans left, that there wouldn't be a security void that the Turks couldn't fill on their own. The Kurds, obviously, are partners on the ground. The YPG were also worried about what might happen to them once the Americans withdrew, if that wasn't coordinated with the Turks, and if the Americans weren't able to get some assurances from the Turks regarding the safety of the YPG members. And so this trip by John Bolton, which really should have taken place before any kind of announcement happened, but the trip by Ambassador Bolton was basically meant to iron out a lot of these details that hadn't been ironed out before. I imagine that he'll go back to Washington with a readout of what happened on his trip, from the discussions that he had, concerns on the part of our allies and partners, and then once he goes back to Washington, briefs the president on his trip, then I imagine we might have a little bit of a better idea on how we're going to proceed moving forward.
Bolton's remarks, echoing, by the way, what the U.S. Secretary of State said last week. Mike Pompeo speaking to conservative news website Newsmax, and he said the importance of ensuring, Nadim Houri, that the Turks don't slaughter the Kurds, the protection of religious minorities there in Syria, all those things are still part of the American mission set. The importance of ensuring that the Turks don't slaughter the Kurds. Those are the words of the U.S. Secretary of State.
It's a mess. I mean, what we haven't heard in this discussion so far is this is not just about the Kurds or geopolitics. There are actually millions of people living in these cities and these towns, and what's going to happen to them. A fight between Turkey and the YPG is not just going to be about Turkey and the YPG. It's going to affect all the civilians living there. There are also a lot of issues post-ISIS that have not been dealt with. Regardless of one's views of whether the U.S. should have intervened or not in Syria, since 2014, it has been the main actor there, the main international actor, the main guarantor of stability. By just withdrawing with no exit plan, no preparation, it's going to leave a lot of the civilians in very vulnerable situation. We're seeing in terms of potential fighting between the YPG and Turkey, but also it's leaving cities behind that have been destroyed. I mean, I don't hear any discussion about who is going to be responsible for rebuilding Raqqa. who is going to be responsible for prosecuting ISIS members? What's going to happen to the at least 2,000 foreign women and children who are held by the SDF forces, who are from 50 different nationalities? What about the foreign fighters who are men? All these issues have not been dealt with by the US administration. So far, everything had been pushed down to the local Kurdish authorities, and now they're being abandoned. I think this is there's a lack of planning, and I think what's missing in the debate is really the concerns around the civilians.
And on that point, one of those points you mentioned, which is those foreign fighters held by the SDF, they've been telling not just the Americans, but also the French, we're holding some of your nationals.
Yeah, and it's not just foreign fighters, by the way. There are about 600 foreign fighters, and there are about 2,000 women and children. Children, you know, French kids, Belgian kids, UK, I mean, all sorts of nationalities. And the SDF forces have been asking the international community to please come and take their nationals. And so far, the overwhelming number of countries, and including all European countries, have refused to do so, frankly hiding behind fake excuses. Again, I think it shows a lack of responsibility and a lack of planning in the fight against ISIS, and no planning for the day after. Even today, I mean, I hear the Turkish president talk about, plans for stabilizing northern Syria. I hear the Americans and the French have been talking about stabilization for northeast Syria for the last 2 years. What is happening on the ground? Not much. And I think the current chaos in the decision-making is reflective of the lack of policy. I mean, I've visited Raqqa now 4 times. The city is being rebuilt at such a slow pace. At this rate, it will not be rebuilt for another 40 years.
Walid Fares, is there any kind of policy in Washington when it comes to what happens to northeast Syria afterwards?
What exists in Washington, what exists, Francois, in any capital in the world, but in this case, of course, the U.S. is the one in charge of that, the protection of that area, are multiple scenarios. There is no one single scenario that takes care of running water all the way up to how many guns the SDF should have. So you have those multiple scenarios, both at the Pentagon, at the NSC, and at the State Department. And I'll take advantage of this point to say that if we don't understand the map on the ground as to what do the SDF YPG want to achieve, what does Turkey, the president of Turkey and his government really wants to achieve, what is the minimum that we in the United States with our allies in the region wants to achieve, then it's very difficult to answer just political questions. Let me give you an example, Francois. What Turkey wants to achieve, and it has been communicated not necessarily on Twitter or in other means, is that a security zone inside Syria, probably somewhere between 40 and 50 kilometers. So when you look at the map, the change that would impact this 50 kilometers, that would mean getting almost to 60% of the depth of the SDF forces. That would mean that there should not be any SDF forces. That means that no Kurdish militia should be armed in that area. That poses problems. So when our NSC advisor goes to Turkey, the discussion is not about principles. We're going to secure the Kurds in general terms. No, it's about, do you really want to go 50 kilometers? Maybe you should go less. Maybe we should put forces between us and Turkey to secure the concerns of Turkey and of the Kurds. The discussions are sometimes much deeper when it goes to the actual map. And of course, I finish with this. Turkey wants to engage against ISIS. The price of Turkey engaging against ISIS is to thrust through northeastern Syria about 80 kilometers to get there. Our military leaders here are asking many questions about that. How would you perform that? What are your logistical lines? So I submit that there are many information that we need to consult before we can even answer political questions.
We're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're talking about the rocky finish to John Bolton's tour of the Middle East. A photo op with Turkey's president canceled, a press conference canceled. This amid disagreements over the U.S.'s continued support to Kurdish-led militias in northeast Syria after Donald Trump's announcement last month of a pullout of the 2,000 U.S. Special Forces that are there. With us to talk about it, he advised Donald Trump during the presidential campaign. Walid Fares joins us from Washington, author of The Lost Spring. From Istanbul, Talha Koza, who teaches at Ibn Khaldun University, researcher at the SETA Foundation think tank. Welcome back as well to Jasmine El Gamal, who is a senior fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, a visiting fellow, and Nadim Houri, the director of counter-terrorism at the program at Human Rights Watch. And just as John Bolton has returned home, Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, kicking off his own Mideast tour. The second leg on it, by the way, will be Cairo, with an expected speech seen as a rebuttal of Barack Obama's 2009 address to the Arab world. Perhaps a taste of that speech coming on the first leg of Pompeo's tour in Jordan's capital.
We also look forward to working continually to counter Tehran's malign influence in the region. Jordan made a powerful statement by recalling its ambassador to Tehran last year in protest of the Iranian regime's flagrant transgressions of security and sovereignty.
Yeah, Walid Fares, this talking about Iran isn't leaving the pullout from northeast Syria. Doesn't that run counter to what Mike Pompeo is professing?
Francois, you're right. That was my opinion, continuing to be my opinion, that if we withdraw abruptly from northeast Syria, it is most likely that, of course, the Turkish forces in the north will have some security zones, but certainly the Iran-backed militias present in Iraq and in Syria will get the maximum of it, including when the Kurds would call on the Assad regime, an ally of Iran, to come and secure some of the borders. So the bottom line is, indeed, if we fail to find a solution in northeastern Syria for stability that would tranquilize Turkey, that would protect the Kurds and their other minorities allies, there is no doubt about it that Iran will take full advantage of it, Francois.
Talha Koza, you agree?
No, I don't agree. I mean, one thing we have to clarify is that there was, YPG was part of a no deal between Turkey and US and Turkey and Russia, or Turkey and another. And Kurds are not equal to YPG, and YPG has no potential and capability to counterbalance Iran. That's why US president tried to deal with Turkey with this. So YPG will never fight and has never fought against Iran. So they have no potential to counterbalance. And they don't even represent the demographic structure of the region. That's why this team was very important, and it should be taken more seriously. So if Turkey tries to control that part of the region, I think if US withdraws, this will be controlled better rather than YPG. So Turkey has more potential to counterbalance Iranian influence at that region, and Turkey has more potential to work with the local actors in comparison to all the other actors. So Turkey is promising to work with the local actors to form councils to work with the local Free Syrian Army elements. So Turkey is just against the YPG, which is considered as a terrorist organization by Turkey. So I think we have to consider this framework more seriously. So we shouldn't expect YPG, PKK to attack Iran. This never happened before.
But it's the other way around, that there would be a power vacuum is what U.S. officials fear. Nadim Houri, how do you see the future of northeast Syria?
I'm not a geopolitician, so I can't say who's going to counter Iran or whether that's the right way to go. But what I can say is, having visited the area now many times, a different period over the last 5 years, the YPG is not foreign to the area at this moment. I mean, there are local councils, there are fighters, local fighters who have joined the YPG over the last number of years. And if there is no plan, frankly, I foresee conflict again, a sort of a mad rush to fill the vacuum with no plan, with Turkey trying to push in, and that there will be armed conflict, with the Syrian regime and Iran trying to fill that vacuum. and sleeper cells from ISIS. And it will just be absolute mess because of the lack of planning.
Because that's not what Talha is saying. Talha is saying that the Turks can administer better that part of northeastern Syria.
And again, I don't want to. The geography of the area is it's quite distinct, right? So you have some areas where Turkey may find natural local allies to help administer the area. But other cities and towns are very Kurdish and are very much pro-YPG. So I don't see how, Turkey would not be seen as a liberator, but probably would be seen as an occupier and will be resisted militarily. So again, my main concern, and Human Rights Watch's main concern, is no one is talking sufficiently about protecting civilians. Even those in the United States are talking about the need to protect the U.S.'s allies. They're not talking about civilians. They're talking about people who fought with them. And, that could be an important and laudable goal. But the U.S. went in and actually bombed with the coalition Raqqa to bits on the premise of liberating it for the civilians of Raqqa. Why aren't we talking about the civilians of Raqqa? Why aren't we talking about the civilians of Qamishli and what will happen to them? I mean, I think, again, no one is talking about Turkey's experience in Manbij. Manbij is an area that, there's been a lot of tensions. Now Russia has been is playing the role of custodian. But, in Afrin, we've documented abuses by Turkish-backed local forces who are not necessarily from the area, because Turkey has used some of its Syrian-backed forces from other parts of the country to send them to Afrin, and we've seen retaliation against Kurds. So without planning, this could end up in a very, very messy situation, and those who will pay the price will be the civilians on the ground.
You mentioned the Russians. Russian military police have started patrolling in Manbij, which is near the Turkish border. The patrolling zone at the edge of the city was previously occupied by Kurdish-led forces, which have been forced to appeal to Syria and Russia for protection. One Russian officer interviewed said the objective is to ensure security in the area we're responsible of and to monitor the situation and movements of armed formations. To ensure security in the area we're responsible of. What is the area that Russia's responsible of, Jasmine El-Gamal?
Well, that's shifted throughout the conflict, honestly, and the areas that the Russians are responsible for are, generally speaking, the areas that the Syrian regime has been responsible for. So as the U.S. Starts to talk about withdrawing, that area becomes larger, the area that the Syrians potentially control, and then by extension that the Russians are responsible for as well.
Those Russian military police setting up there, the Kurds are reportedly happy to see them there because they see it as a buffer against an onslaught by the Turks. Your thoughts about the toing and froing we're seeing from high-level Kurdish officials to Moscow to Damascus in the past days?
Well, Francois, it makes perfect sense that the Kurds would reach out to the Russians and the Syrians to try to protect themselves in case of a hasty, unplanned or uncoordinated U.S. withdrawal. I've written about this before. Others have talked about this before. If the U.S. was planning to withdraw without sufficiently securing or securing sufficient assurances for the fate of the YPG and the fighters who fought alongside us, then they would have no choice but to go to the people that they think could protect them. And right now, that means the Syrian regime and the Russians.
Wally Fares, it's clear the U.S. president wants to get out. If the Russians are there to pick up the slack, is he happy with that?
Of course, he's not happy with having the Russians covering all the areas where the United States will withdraw from. But reality on the ground is different. Russia, though on the map you see it, covering all the pro-Iranian, pro-Assad regime forces deployment, what they're doing, in fact, is providing the air cover. The real physical presence of Russia is on the coast. Plus, they send few units of military police when the regime and the Iranians ask them to, like in the south or some ceasefire here and there. Russia doesn't have a corps, a Russian corps that can deploy all over Syria, in the same way they did it in many other places in Eastern Europe. But having said that, the foot soldiers of Russia are the Iranian militias and Hezbollah and the Assad regime. So you could consider them as one bloc. Of course, the United States would not like to see that happening, a complete control of Iran and Russia over all of Syria. But it's what we're going to do, in the sense that if we decide to stay in any shape or form with considering Turkish interests, then that barrage between Iraq and Syria will stop Russia from taking that control. If we want to withdraw and have another force that is not in coordination with us, then definitely Russia, Iran, and Assad forces are going to make progress. So it depends on our choice, our strategic choice.
Tyler Koza, your thoughts on seeing those Russian military police patrolling in Manbij?
Well, I mean, that's a possibility, but, the problem is not the Russian presence, or the local units can be mobilized, they can be trained for these purposes. So I think I have to clarify again. I mean, Turkey's concern is with the terrorist groups. If they withdraw from the region, Turkey can work with US, Turkey can work with Russia. Turkey can also train the local forces for the security. So these are all possibilities. But US withdrawal will reduce the tension within the field and probably may accelerate the peace process in Syria. So that is also considered as a positive development by Russia. So for the time being, US presence at that part of the Syria prevents that kind of deal, and also makes Turkey unhappy about the presence of all these groups. So in that sense, this coordinated withdrawal, will be an important step towards dealing a holistic political agreement in Syria.
Jasmine El-Gamal, do you agree with that a coordinated withdrawal of the United States will reduce the tension and help bring peace to Syria?
Yes, of course, I agree with it. And that's why I said earlier in the show that this whole thing should have been coordinated before any sort of public announcement. So since that wasn't the case, the best thing that can happen now is to coordinate fully with not just the Turks, but also with partners on the ground, with the Europeans. The French have said that they're not going to withdraw their forces. So we need to figure out who is going to be where the division of responsibility lies, and how to move forward in a way that doesn't actually make the situation worse, Francois, in the months ahead.
Nadim Houri, there was a phone call on Monday between Donald Trump and his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron about this very issue. What Jasmine was mentioning, the substance of that phone call, we don't know it. We know it. They talked about the withdrawal, the issues that you've been bringing up. What are the chances that those came up in conversation?
I'm not sure they did, because I think they're still talking about the need to coordinate. And I think, I rejoin here what Jasmine was saying. I think it's essential to talk about substance. Who is going to be doing what? Who is going to be responsible for what? I think that, they need to be giving answers in terms of the transition, in terms of the security of the area, to ensure that there's no security vacuum. The people who've been living in these areas are exhausted. People who have actually had to survive in Raqqa over the last 5 years cannot survive another round of violence. They just have nothing left. And at the same time, so they need to start talking about coordination, but really we need them to talk about substance, almost like an exit memo. Please, President of the United States, if you're going to leave Northeast Syria, please come up with an exit memo and say what you're going to be doing about these different things, because this is the minimum responsible thing that the U.S. should be doing at this stage. Obviously coordinating with its partners, but talking about substance. And all the regional actors have a stake in what happens in Northeast Syria. So not to have a plan is to actually invite chaos and ongoing fighting. And I just want to answer, my Kurdish colleague here. The problem is, where is the YPG going to go? I mean, the overwhelming numbers of the YPG are local fighters. So what, even that, it's not like they're going to just sort of withdraw to some imaginary place. Yes, there may be some foreigners in the YPG command units, but the overwhelming majority are locals. And I think this is the challenge. And the U.S. and Turkey are allies for decades. And the U.S. has been an ally of the YPG for at least 4 years now. They should have figured out these issues 4 years ago, not only 2 months ago.
Not only 2 months ago, Talal Kozi, it was the YPG that did the bulk of the fighting on the ground against ISIS.
Well, I mean, there was a deal between Turkey and U.S. about the YPG. So U.S. authorities promised to stop supporting YPG after the fight against the ISIS. Same was about the Manbij deal. So this wasn't a structural kind of agreement between U.S. and YPG. So the thing is that some of the local actors can be dissolved and integrated to other units, but the radical elements of the YPG are quite exclusionary. I mean, they violate human rights, they have human rights violation, they recruit the child soldiers, they oppress the people. So if there is a more inclusive framework for regional security that is composed of the actors, the local actors, that's an acceptable scenario. But the leaders of this organization should either go to Iraq, some other places, and leave this organization, dissolve the organization. So I think this may work better for the future of that region. So we also have hundreds of thousands of Kurds who escaped from northern Syria from the operations of the YPG. I mean, they didn't want to join to the fight with YPG. There are some other elements that escaped from the YPG. So there can be more inclusive, less radical security apparatus that can incorporate the local actors.
But as Nadim Houri was saying, many of them are local actors. Let me ask you, Tala. That initial phone call between Donald Trump and Recep Tayyip Erdogan that preceded that Trump tweet announcing the withdrawal from northeast Syria, it was also accompanied with talk of a visit by Trump to Turkey.
Yes.
Where do you think that all stands now after John Bolton's visit and the way it ended?
I think there is no problem between Trump and Erdogan. I think there is cacophony in Washington, D.C. So some actors within the Pentagon didn't accept this agreement. I think there is some kind of resistance from both Bolton, State Department, and Pentagon about this. I think at some point, Trump may insist on his position. I mean, I sent you to cut the deal and harmonize the withdrawal with Turkey, and you are putting new conditions. So I think this is not compatible with the terms of the agreement, and I think there is overall agreement or understanding between President Erdogan and President Trump. And I think if you look at Trump's explanations and Trump's the recent policies with regard to Patriot missiles, which were previously not accepted for the sale or approved for the sale, or the FBI's work on veto, I think it seems that there's a broader understanding between two presidents, but the bureaucrats in between are trying to make the things much more complicated in this deal.
Walid Fares, you hear that? Bureaucrats are trying to undermine the president.
Let me summarize what I see is happening. The president had a phone call. Before that phone call, there were other phone calls and talks within the circles of the president and, of course, on the other side. That's why the phone call happened. Phone calls don't happen overnight. He insisted on the principle of, we are going to be leaving eastern or northeastern Syria. Can you help us? Can you take a role? President of Turkey said, oh, yes, we can help you. What was not discussed, as far as I understand, are the details. Help you, meaning we're going to move in, disarm the YPG, the SDF. There is no support for that in America, even in the Trump base, in Congress, in the Senate, and the two parties. The support exists for the idea of withdrawing. The support exists for the idea of satisfying the Turks on security issues, but not on dismantling northeastern Syria. This is in the most summarized way one could put it of what's happening in Washington.
So, Jasmine El-Gamal, where do we go from here?
where do we go from here? Actually, I want to address what Tala said about bureaucrats trying to undermine the president's plan, Francois, if you'll allow me for a second, just because I think that's, you know, as a former civil servant and as someone who worked in a bureaucracy, I think it's incredibly dangerous to kind of evoke that image of a bunch of bureaucrats trying to run around destroying a president's plan. That is certainly not the case. Generally speaking, and it is certainly not the case now. Bureaucrats and civil servants carry out orders by the president that are clearly articulated, that are written down for the record, and that are disseminated to the different departments and agencies so that everyone knows what their role is. And so now I'm going to start answering your question, which is where do we go from here? The answer is it's not clear. And it's not clear because they're these procedures that usually summarize decisions taken by leadership and provide instructions to the folks, you know, in the different departments and agencies who are meant to carry out those instructions simply don't exist right now. We have an idea of what the president wants, but to be honest, the bureaucrats that Tala is talking about probably have not much more of an understanding than the general public does at this point, because they haven't been given clear instructions to proceed with the president's plan, because the president's plan itself is yet to be clarified, both to the public, to our allies, to our partners, and to the civil servants working in those departments and agencies.
All right, we'll see how it plays out. I want to thank you so much, Jasmine El-Gamal, for joining us from Amman, Tala Al-Cloza for being with us from Istanbul, Walid Fares in Washington, Nadim Houri stayed with us. Media Watch is next.